The wind carried the howl of a snow-laden gale across the wastelands beyond the wall, whistling through the ancient ice as though it sought to speak in hushed warnings to those who stood watch upon its heights. So much had changed already. The sun had begun its slow descent behind a veil of gray clouds, casting the final hours of daylight into a frigid twilight. Far below the wall, uneasy men wrapped in black cloaks clutched at their bows and spears, not knowing what shape the coming darkness might bring forth. They had never expected to face the threat that now rolled toward them like a cresting wave of doom. Yet in these uncertain times, one divergence of destiny would loom larger than any single soldier's fear. For Bran Stark had never become the three-eyed raven, and the tapestry of fate was unraveling stitch by stitch. When Bran's fall from the tower in Winterfell first changed his life, it seemed as if destiny had cast him into an unrelenting night, crippling him and forcing him to see the world from a vantage point that robbed him of many childhood freedoms. The road that was meant to lead him north had been proposed. He was supposed to have journeyed beyond the wall, accompanied by the Reed siblings, and there he would meet the ancient Greenseer who would grant him the power of the visions. In another version of history, that path would have led him to become the three-eyed raven, to discover truths about the White Walkers and pass crucial knowledge to those who sought to defend the realm of men. But fate, sly as ever, had twisted. He had grown ill at the very dawn of their journey. A ghostly fever overcame him at the last safe keep in the gift, just short of the wall. Maester Aemon, old and wise, had done his best from his station in the night fort, but the ailments that took hold in Bran's young body refused to yield for many days. Even after the fever broke, he had lost so much strength he could not travel further into the wilderness, nor did his companions think it wise to risk it. Thus, instead of forging ahead to find the Greenseer, Jojen and Mira had turned him about. They bore him back to the south, nursing him slowly, sorrowful that the distant summons from the great heart trees in the far north would remain unanswered. And with that single change in plan, an avalanche of consequences began to rumble across Westeros. Bran Stark survived his sickness but emerged from it no Greenseer, only a boy in a battered body, stripped of illusions, still dreaming wolf dreams but with no guide to hone them, no teacher to show him the Weirwood labyrinth or the secrets of the old gods. He felt phantom aches in his legs and an ache far deeper still in his heart. Perhaps he was free of the burdens that came with an awakened mind, but he was also cut off from that vast tapestry of knowledge that might have united the living in common cause. In that subtle vacuum of knowledge, nightmares took form. Back in Winterfell, Sansa Stark received her brother with tears of relief, for she had feared she might never see him again. In this altered timeline, rumors from King's Landing had foretold of chaos, Joffrey's cruelty, the Lannisters' cunning, the betrayal of the North. She had escaped that serpentine court and found her way home, carrying bruises upon her heart that few could soothe. Arya arrived not long after, wild-eyed from her own travels, haunted by the images of a mother and brother lost at the Red Wedding. Jon Snow was still at the wall, sworn to the Night's Watch, trying to rally his brothers for an impending war few south of the Neck would believe in. For the world was uncertain and the living debated politics, crowns, and old feuds, not knowing that the true threat lay beyond the horizon. Time rolled on in a creeping wave of tension. The events in the capital grew muddied as the small folk whispered of intrigues. Cersei Lannister was said to cling fiercely to power, but the shape of that power shifted with each passing rumor. Daenerys Targaryen grew in might across the narrow sea, forging her path with dragons. The North needed unity, but it was fractured by betrayal and the suspicion of houses that had once been loyal bannermen to Winterfell. Meanwhile, the White Walkers advanced. The Watchers on the wall glimpsed them, shapes in the snow that turned men's blood to ice, an army of whites behind them. Samwell Tarly had returned from the frosty edges of that domain with trembling lips, telling tales of what he had seen. Still, the realm paid little heed. Southern lords laughed off his warnings as improbable nightmares, as if the others were only the hushed stories of nursemaids. In the midst of this brewing storm, Bran tried to recall scraps of his own strange dreams. Sometimes he saw the heart trees with their red leaves and solemn faces, beckoning him with silent whispers. He felt the presence of a giant raven in the periphery of these dreams, an entity that waited, no less ancient than the forest itself. Yet, because he had turned aside from that path, he would wake to confusion and an aching sense of something lost. In time, he feared that the knowledge he was meant to carry would be lost too. He confided, in low tones, to Mira, who felt a shard of regret each time she met his eyes. One day, Bran would say, voice quivering with uncertain hope, "Someone else will have to gain that knowledge, or I must find it some other way. The White Walkers are out there. They're marching, and I see them in my dreams, Mira." She gave him a faint, sad smile. "We will find a way, somehow. The living must not stand alone in ignorance." But she too was frightened. She had seen the cost of that journey, had watched Jojen fade before her eyes on some nights, as if the visions had burned him from the inside out. Perhaps it was for the best that they had turned back, that Bran never fully opened his mind to the old god's power. And yet, a greater fear lingered. Their knowledge of the enemy was limited, a fragment of the whole truth. And war had always been fueled by ignorance as much as by cunning. Word reached Winterfell that Jon Snow was calling for all the lords of the North to unite. Though few had answered, enough answered to stand with him. House Mormont, House Glover, House Serwyn, old ties were reignited, but the bitterness left by the Bolton occupation and the devastation of the War of the Five Kings had not fully healed. And there were other houses that had turned away or teetered on the brink of betrayal, uncertain whether they should align themselves with the notion of an undead threat. Some whispered that Jon Snow was half mad with grief and desperation, that his oath to the Night's Watch had broken his mind. After all, they said, what fool would speak of White Walkers returning after 8,000 years, when far more real threats existed in the form of Lannisters and the Iron Throne? In the Great Hall of Winterfell, a meager assembly of northern lords met with the Starks. Bran was seated in a high-backed chair at one side, silent while Sansa stood in her place of authority. Though she was no warrior, she had learned how to speak with measured courtesy and quiet power, gleaned from bitter lessons in King's Landing. Arya lurked near the edges, lost in the swirl of a cloak, her eyes flicking from face to face. Mira Reed and Podrick Payne were also in attendance, the former acting as quiet counsel to Bran, and the latter having arrived in the retinue of Brienne of Tarth, who had sworn to protect the Stark girls. Jon had traveled south from the Wall for this council. His face was pale as the driven snow, and a raw fervor burned in his eyes as he pleaded with the lords to come to the Watch's aid. He had the look of a man who had died once, and though the rumors of his resurrection were whispered in corners, few truly believed it. What was certain was his desperation to unite the living. Tyrion Lannister had once said a hopeless man was a dangerous thing, and in the hush of that hall, the lords could sense that Jon would rather die than fail. His truths had the ring of steel against flint. Our enemy does not care for crowns, nor gold, nor banners, he told them, voice reverberating against the stone walls. They will come for us in our homes, in our lands, and they will kill every last man, woman, and child. If the wall falls, the North will be the first to face the storm. But it will not stop here, and it will not stop in the south either. All Westeros will fall. We must gather all the forces we can, there is no time to lose. But still the lords hesitated. Some demanded proof. Others asked if the rumors of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons might be real, and if so, could that not be used against the undead? They wanted to see the threat firsthand, or at least hear of it from more than the once bastard son of Eddard Stark. For while they respected Ned Stark's memory, they also remembered the swirl of dark rumors about Jon's parentage. They were not wholeheartedly convinced. When Bran spoke, he tried to convey what little he had seen in his dreams. They're real, he managed, his voice quaking with urgency. I've seen them in the dark. I've seen their eyes, blue as ice. They raised the dead, an entire army of the risen. You must believe us. Yet without the full power of the Green Seer in him, he could offer only the half-formed images of a boy's nightmares. The lords exchanged uncertain glances. Some were moved by the sincerity in the boy's voice, but sincerity was not always enough to forge alliances. They wanted practical truths, immediate proofs. They had lost too many men to far more tangible wars to commit blindly to what might be a child's fancy. Ultimately, the council ended with lukewarm pledges of support, but any deeper unity was absent. Winterfell's halls seemed to grow colder as the men departed, leaving Jon and his siblings with a sense of dread. Later that night, in the quiet corridor of the keep, Jon caught Bran by the arm. Bran, though older now and wise in his own way, saw the glint of sorrow in Jon's eyes. The corridors flickered with the glow of torches. I wish you could show them what you see, Jon murmured. Bran nodded. I do too. He looked down at his still legs, swallowed thickly. I feel as though I was meant to do something. to become something that could help. But I couldn't. And now, I don't know how to stop them. Jon placed a gloved hand on Bran's shoulder. We'll do what we can, the best we can. We must stand together, all of us. Sansa, Arya, Yumi. The North remembers. That has to mean something. He exhaled, heavy with the burdens he carried. We'll prepare for war. We have to. The White Walkers won't wait until we're ready. A savage winter storm hit soon after, howling across the battlements and burying the northern roads under feet of snow. The supply lines from the south grew precarious, and roving bands of desperate men and outlaws harried the smaller hamlets. The rapine and looting only added to the sense that the north was spiraling into lawlessness. From the vantage of Winterfell's ramparts, the realm itself seemed on the brink of disintegration even before the arrival of the great threat from beyond the wall. Within a fortnight, word arrived that Eastwatch by the Sea had fallen. The castle near the eastern edge of the wall had come under sudden assault. A rider from Castle Black, gaunt, half-frozen, swaying in the saddle of an exhausted horse, told a harrowing tale of whites scaling the cliffs, of the White Walkers themselves breaching the gates, ice spears felling defenders. They had come in the dead of night, silent but for the scraping of bone on ice. Men screamed, horns sounded, but it was chaos. Blood froze to the ramparts as men died in the swirling snow, their eyes open wide in terror. Eastwatch was lost. The remnants of the garrison had fled by sea if they could, or been overtaken and joined the undead ranks. Panic took hold among the Night's Watch. They redoubled the defenses of Castle Black, uncertain how soon the enemy would strike again. Some spoke of a breach in the wall. Others insisted that some dark magic had allowed the White Walkers to pass. No matter the truth, the dead were here now, unstoppable. Their dread generals perched on skeletal horses amid the frozen gloom. Eastwatch had been the first to fall. Castle Black might be next. When the messenger's words reached Winterfell, Jon Snow summoned every lord and lady of the North once more. But this time, fewer came. The roads were too dangerous. And of the ones who did come, a dour acceptance settled over them. The White Walkers were real. Eastwatch had been a bulwark for centuries, gone in a single night. The gloom of that knowledge settled in every corner of Winterfell's great hall, stifling argument. The question was no longer if the threat was real, but how they might survive it. And in that moment, the realm realized it knew so very little about its enemy. Secrets that, in another turning of the wheel of time, Bran Stark's Greenseer powers would have revealed. "I've sent ravens to all the houses and to the south," Jon said, voice subdued. "I'll ride for Castle Black soon. We'll fortify, but we can't hope to hold them at the wall, not if they found a way to cross so easily." From the high table, a bitter voice rang out. Lord Glover, his face drawn, said, "And where is the king in the south, or the dragon queen, or any of them? We are alone, are we not?" Sansa glanced at Jon, then rose. She tried her best to keep her composure. "Daenerys Targaryen has landed in Dragonstone, we believe. There are stories of her forces gathering near King's Landing. She might be persuaded to help, but we have no time to wait for southern politics to unravel. The White Walkers will march soon. Our only chance is to gather everyone we can to the north, or else form a plan that gives us a chance to survive." An uneasy murmur spread. Some proposed retreating south, abandoning the north altogether, but that notion was quickly dismissed by proud lords who would not abandon their ancestral homes. The next hours were spent in a swirl of frantic discussion, arguments raging over resources, battle tactics, possible strongholds to fall back upon. None of it felt enough. None of it would ever feel enough against this ancient terror. More than once, pale-faced men looked to Bran as if expecting him to reveal a hidden truth or power that might save them. Every time, he felt his cheeks heat with shame. He had no fresh visions to offer. He had no revelation about the Night King. The boy who might have been a green seer could only remain silent, the drumbeat of his heart pounding fear into his veins. Sometime near dawn, after the meeting had splintered, Bran sat by the hearth in his old chambers, a blanket draped over his legs. Mira stood near him. Her face bore the weariness of long nights and heavier burdens. In the gloom, shadows danced across the walls, conjuring shapes out of half-burnt logs. "Are you sure you can't try again?" she asked, gently, as if uncertain how to phrase her plea. "Try to slip into the wolf dreams you mentioned. See if you can find anything, any guidance from the old gods?" Bran closed his eyes. The crackling flames were the only answer for a long moment. I try. I see glimpses, but it's like looking through a murky pond. There's a voice at the other side, but I can't make out the words. His breath rattled in his chest. And the old gods, maybe they're as powerless as we are, Mira. Maybe they needed me to fulfill a purpose, but I refused the call. She knelt beside him. You never refused it. Fate turned you away because of your fever, the sickness that could have killed you. You didn't make that choice. Bran shook his head, but said nothing. They stayed like that until the dawn's pale light replaced the sputtering flames. A week later, Winterfell was upturned by a flurry of arrivals. Refugees, drawn by rumors of the Stark's shelter, trudged through the heavy snows from smaller villages to the keep, doubling its population. Some bore children in their arms, lips cracked with cold. Others were gaunt, hollow-eyed. Many told hushed stories of shapes in the darkness, of families vanishing. Wildlings, too, began to trickle south of the wall. They had seen what was coming, and though the old enmity between wildlings and kneelers persisted, the survivors had no choice but to beg for mercy. Tormund Giantsbane arrived at Jon's side, battered from the fight at Eastwatch, speaking grimly of how the undead legions had spread across the coast. With each tale, fear gnawed deeper into the heart of Winterfell. Amid this chaos, Arya trained under the watchful eye of Brienne. She honed her swordcraft, her dagger skills, her stealth. She had her own brand of determination, fueled by the ghosts in her past. Sansa tried to keep order, rationing out what supplies Winterfell still had. But with so many mouths to feed, and the dead of winter upon them, resources were strained. Conflicts inevitably arose. Whispers of betrayal flitted about the halls, especially when lesser lords heard that still no great aid was on its way from King's Landing or Dragonstone. The Targaryen queen, rumor said, was locked in a siege of the capital, tangling with the Lannisters. The Iron Throne was a glittering lure that overshadowed the plight of the North in southern eyes. Men fought over power while an apocalypse gathered in the North. So it had always been, so it would ever be, it seemed. Bran was restless. Confined to his chair, he found little peace in the swirl of the castle's tension. Sometimes he ventured out into the Godswood, letting Hodder, still alive, still at his side, for they had never braved the journey beyond the wall, push him across the crisp snow. In the shadow of the great weirwood tree, he would close his eyes and attempt to calm his thoughts. This weirwood was a silent sentinel, its pale bark etched with a sorrowful red face. If there was any place to hear the old gods, it was here. But each time what he found was emptiness, or fleeting glimpses of the future, or the past, that made no sense. A glimpse of a dragon's silhouette against a moonlit sky, a fleeting image of knights locked in bloody battle, a swirl of blue eyes in the darkness, silent as the grave. One evening, he drifted off in the hush of the Godswood. He dreamt of standing on a vast plain of ice, alone. The wind whipped at him. In the distance, towering spires of shimmering ice loomed, a fortress not made by mortal hands. He felt the approach of an ancient presence, older than speech, older than the traditions of men. Then a shape materialized before him. A tall figure with flesh like rime, wearing a crown of ice, eyes like chips of frozen malice. The Night King. The figure lifted a hand, as if beckoning Bran closer. Behind him stretched an endless army, men and giants and beasts, all with eyes that glowed the same cold blue. Their numbers were beyond reckoning. Bran wanted to turn away, to run, but the Night King reached out, not touching him. But the gesture alone filled Bran's heart with a terror so strong he jolted awake, gasping, tears freezing on his cheeks. Hodder hovered, concerned, repeating Bran's name in a low moan, Hodder, Hodder, as if the single word held every question in the world. In that moment, Bran recalled how, in another life, Hodder might have died to protect him on that terrible journey to meet the three-eyed raven. Now, that path had never been fully walked. Hodder lived, and yet they were both trapped in a new doom. Bran rubbed tears from his face and felt bitterness gather in his throat. If only he had become the three-eyed raven, would that knowledge help them? Would it let him stand against the Night King with power rather than fear? He told no one of this particular dream, for he had no solution or comfort to give them. It was a vision of despair. News traveled quickly that the White Walkers were advancing westward along the base of the wall, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Small settlements where the Watch once maintained outposts had fallen silent, overrun by the dead. The undead had not yet reached Castle Black in a massive wave, but the skirmishes grew more frequent. Jon Snow pressed the northern houses to send what men they could to reinforce the wall, but few answered the call wholeheartedly. They were too busy trying to defend their own keeps or simply survive the winter. Thus, Castle Black's defenses remained tragically thin. Tormund and a band of wildlings who had traveled with him to Winterfell decided to head back north in a mad gamble. They aimed to ambush smaller white patrols, gather intelligence, maybe even capture a white to prove the threat to the southern lords. Some echo of the plan from another timeline. But in this version, there was no king's mandate behind them, no unity in the cause. They were alone, venturing into the White Wastes in a last-ditch attempt to stir southern hearts. Bran knew that if Tormund's group failed, the realm might never gain the proof it needed. But he was helpless to do more than watch them depart, cursing his weakness. On a gray, snow-swept morning soon after, the gates of Winterfell opened to an unexpected retinue. Riders in scaled armor led the way, their banners showing the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Behind them, men of the Unsullied marched with perfect discipline, their spears upright even in the biting cold. Upon a black horse rode a figure that made the watchers gasp. Daenerys Stormborn, silver-haired, clad in furs for the northern cold, had come at last. At her side, close as a shadow, was Ser Jorah Mormont, his expression set with solemn resolve. Farther back, the dwarf Tyrion Lannister hunched in his saddle, his face hidden beneath a heavy hood. The presence of a Lannister in Winterfell might have sparked outrage under other circumstances, but times had changed beyond measure. And overshadowing all else, perched high above the battlements on swirling winds, a monstrous shape roared. A dragon, black scales shining with ripples of deep green. He circled once, his cry echoing over the plains, before descending beyond the walls to land in the courtyard, melting snow beneath the fury of his breath. Word spread that Daenerys had bested the Lannisters in battle and forced a tentative ceasefire, traveling north after receiving Jon Snow's pleas by Raven. She had come with only one dragon, Drogon, for the other two had been left behind, guarding newly won territories. Why she had not brought them as well was unclear. Some rumored that another one of her dragons had been wounded, others whispered darker possibilities. But the important thing was that she had chosen to come. In the courtyard, the hush was absolute as she dismounted, her breath steaming, while northern soldiers stared at her in awe and a little fear. Jon Snow met her with a guarded expression. They had never met before, but he had a certain flinty respect for her, for she had come. She had chosen to see with her own eyes rather than remain in the comfort of the south. Sansa stood nearby, uncertain how to greet this dragon queen. Tyrion offered his customary bow, but even he seemed subdued in the face of the northern gloom and the weight of what they were about to witness. When Daenerys's party gathered in the Great Hall, the conversation was tense. Some northern lords seethed to see a Targaryen in Winterfell. Yet even they recognized that the time for old grudges was gone. Daenerys spoke with impassioned conviction, saying she had come to see this threat herself. But her words faltered when confronted with the horrifying accounts. She looked to Jon. She looked to Sansa, to Arya, even to Bran. Her gaze lingered on Bran's still form. "And you say you have visions," she said quietly, though half-doubt lingered in her voice. Bran drew in a shaky breath. "I do, but they are incomplete. I can't show you proof, Your Grace. All I know is that the White Walkers are marching, and they will kill everything in their path." Daenerys's pale brows furrowed. She was no stranger to prophecy or visions. She had experienced her own cryptic glimpses in the House of the Undying across the sea. Yet she yearned for certainty. "I brought Drogon north to see this army myself. If it is real, I will burn every one of those demons with dragonfire. They will not stand against me." A heavy silence followed. Tyrion cleared his throat. "If I may, Your Grace, rumors say the White Walkers are unaffected by most weapons, but dragonfire might be different. We do not know. We only suspect. All of this is uncharted territory for us. The old stories say they were defeated by the children of the forest and the first men, using dragonglass and Valyrian steel. Dragonfire was never tested in those stories, as far as I recall. Ser Yora nodded. It stands to reason that dragonfire could work like dragonglass, but we should not rest on assumptions. We should gather as much dragonglass as possible. Use every advantage. The cold does not suffer mistakes. Jon agreed. We found a source of dragonglass at Dragonstone's mines, but we have not had time to bring enough north. We need more than that if the armies of the dead are as large as we fear, and they are larger than we fear. His words weighed heavily on those present. Daenerys inhaled, letting the gravity settle into her. Finally, she said, "Then let us confirm the truth. I will mount Drogon and fly north of the wall. Let me see this army for myself. If they are as legion as you say, then we'll need both of my other dragons as well. And we'll need every house in Westeros to stand together." A flicker of grim determination passed between Jon and Daenerys. Sansa regarded them both, worry etched in her brow, but also a faint hope. Perhaps Daenerys' presence would finally convince the realm of the threat. Perhaps the combined might of Dragonfire and the northern host could stand a chance. Yet, somewhere in the recesses of Bran's mind, a voice whispered warnings. He had dreamed of a dragon's sword high above the ice, had glimpsed a javelin of ice hurled by the Night King. He did not know if it was only a nightmare or something more, but it sent a shiver through him deeper than the cold. He tried to speak of it to Mira, but even as he tried to find the words, they felt hollow. He was not the three-eyed raven. He could not unravel the possible futures clearly enough. Fear not at him, though. Before a plan could be fully formed, riders from Castle Black thundered through the gates of Winterfell, half dead from exhaustion. The undead were moving along the wall in a massive force, the largest host yet seen. They would soon come upon Castle Black and likely break through. Thousands upon thousands of wights had been sighted. The Night King himself had been glimpsed riding a monstrous dead horse across the snowy plains. The time for idle discussion had ended. Jon moved swiftly. He assembled a force of men from the gathered northern lords, a fraction of what might have been possible if all the region had mustered. Daenerys agreed to fly ahead on Drogon, to scout and, if possible, burn the vanguard of the undead. The other houses debated whether to send more men or hunker down in their keeps. In desperation, many did muster their forces, if only because the alternative was waiting to be slaughtered. Sansa remained in Winterfell to coordinate defenses, watch over refugees, and handle the urgent supply issues. Bran, though anxious to be of use, could do little but watch them go. Arya, fierce as steel, donned her leathers and joined the war party heading north. "This is my home," she said quietly to Bran, squeezing his hand. "I won't let them take it." Then she turned, face set, and marched away. Bran watched them depart from the ramparts, the sky swirling with gray flakes of snow. The sight of the massive host departing was both impressive and pitiful. Impressive in that they possessed war horses, knights, archers, and a dragon. Pitiful in that, for all their bravery, it seemed a paltry force against the rumors of the dead's numbers. Drogon's roar shook the ramparts, and Bran felt a pang in his chest, uncertain of the prophecy he had half dreamed. But there was no turning back from their path now. In the days that followed, Winterfell braced itself. Fewer travelers came seeking refuge, for the roads were nearly impassable. The wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves each night, and the cold crept into every stone, every plank of wood, so that even a roaring fire did little to ward off the chill. Sansa roamed the corridors, seeing to the distribution of scarce rations. She comforted children, listened to the pleas of frightened mothers. She was more queen than any at King's Landing, though she wore no crown. Bran spent his hours in the Godswood, trying with all his might to slip into some deeper state of awareness. Now and then, the ravens would swirl overhead, black wings beating the sky, and he wondered if he could warg into them, as he had once done with his direwolf, Summer. But that wolf was gone, lost to the tragedies that had befallen them on the road north. Without a mentor, his abilities remained partial. He felt them within him, simmering under the surface, but he had no key to unlock their full potential. And the war advanced relentlessly without waiting for him to discover those secrets. At last, word came. Castle Black had fallen. The survivors fled south, battered and bloody, with an army of the dead close behind. The Night's Watch, that ancient order, was scattered, reduced to a handful of ragged men. Among those who arrived at Winterfell's gates was Ed Tollett, clutching a wound at his side. He had tears in his eyes when he spoke to Sansa. They came like a wave, unstoppable, he whispered in the courtyard. Many gathered around him. We tried to hold. Jon Snow and the Queen tried to burn as many as they could. The dragon's fire was immense. It lit the night sky. Hundreds of whites burned, thousands maybe. But they kept coming. And then the White Walkers came at us from the flank. We had no chance. We retreated. Somewhere behind him, a silent crowd parted, revealing Tormund Giantsbane and Gendry Baratheon, battered from the fight. Tormund's usual bravado was absent. He spat blood, muttering, "They're coming south. They'll be here in days, maybe less." The dragon did a lot of damage, though. She burned them in great swathes. But I fear we lost too many men to even call it a victory. A hush spread. Then Sansa managed to ask, "Where are Jon? Daenerys, the others?" Tormund's eyes flicked away. "Your sister, Arya, fought like a demon. I last saw her on the ramparts with the Hound and Brienne cutting down whites. They were covering the retreat. The Queen flew south, I think, with the dragon. She might have taken Jon. I'm not sure. It was chaos. The dead were everywhere." His voice trembled in a way that no one had ever heard from Tormund before. "I saw the Night King. He was unstoppable." Bran felt a hollow echo in his chest. The battle was lost and the great host of the dead was on the move, unstoppable. Scenes of terror flashed behind his eyes, an unstoppable tide of corpses streaming across the snow, devouring all life. If Jon and Daenerys survived, they could be anywhere, perhaps in flight, or perhaps mortally wounded and hidden somewhere in the frigid wilderness. This was the very chaos that might have been averted with knowledge. If only there had been a Greenseer to unite them sooner, to guide them to the secrets of Dragonglass, or to help them strike the Night King at a vulnerable moment. But that future was gone, and now the realm teetered on the brink. 2 days later, Winterfell's outriders reported that the undead host was approaching. Blowing horns in the night, the watchers on the castle walls glimpsed the flicker of torches in the distance, though whether the undead needed light, none could say. More likely, the flickering was the glow of villages burning in the path of the whites. Each day brought them closer, while the defenders made frantic preparations. Men, women, and even older children were armed with spears. The blacksmiths hammered day and night, forging any weapon they could from the small caches of dragonglass that had been brought from Dragonstone. But the supply was pitifully small, enough to arm only a fraction of the defenders. The rest would rely on normal steel and raw courage, both of which would do little good if the undead swarmed them in overwhelming numbers. Sansa tried to maintain calm, but she saw the fear in every face. They were outnumbered, outmatched. If Daenerys did not return with Drogon in time, Winterfell would face the largest undead army ever to walk the earth. And even if she did return, would one dragon be enough? Tormund and the Northern Lords, battered from the previous battle, tried to form lines of archers, pike walls, anything that might hold the undead at bay for a time. But the cold truth was that no fortress in history had withstood an enemy that could raise its own dead from the bodies of the fallen. With each casualty, the undead ranks would grow. On the eve of the battle, Bran rolled his chair into the godwood. Snow fell in thick clusters, swirling around the towering heart tree. He felt the presence of the old gods more strongly here than anywhere, and in his heart an anguished plea formed. He let the hush drape over him, sinking into a sort of half-sleep, half-trance. He tried to open himself to any guidance that might still linger in the Weirwood's ancient memory. He thought of the original three-eyed raven who had once been Brynden Rivers, a man of House Targaryen by blood, who had spent decades melding with the roots of the forest. In the timeline Bran should have followed, he would have met that being, learned from him, become something beyond mortal constraints. The swirl of regrets in his mind threatened to drown him. Then, in the murk, a faint voice seemed to whisper, a whine through the branches. Bran could not tell if it was real or an echo of his own desperation. In his mind's eye, he saw an image, a single dagger of dragonglass, gleaming black, thrust into the chest of a figure of ice. Then he saw the shape of the Night King, crown of frost on his brow, standing amidst swirling shadows. A swirl of ravens soared around him, cawing in unison, and the heart tree's face bled streaks of red sap that stained the snow. The vision vanished, leaving Bran breathless, tears on his cheeks. Perhaps it was a clue, or nothing but a reflection of fear. All he knew was that one strike might end the Night King. If the stories were true, if the Night King's destruction would break the magic animating all the whites, then all it would take was a single well-placed blow of dragonglass or Valyrian steel. But how to deliver it? Their best chance might have been Arya, but she was gone, trapped in the hellish chaos at Castle Black. Rattled by the cold, he returned to the keep, where Sansa greeted him with quiet relief. The last candlelit hours before the battle were a subdued vigil. People prayed to whatever gods they believed in, or drank themselves into a stupor, or sat quietly by loved ones. Maester Vulcan moved through the halls, distributing potions and salves he had prepared, though he suspected they would be of little use if the battle were lost. The entire castle seemed to breathe a low, steady sigh of terror. The night dragged on, each minute elongated by dread, until the horns began to sound, deep, echoing notes that quivered through the frigid air. The undead had arrived. All at once, men and women poured out onto the ramparts, the courtyard, the walls. Torches and braziers glowed. Archers took their positions. Swords were drawn. Down below, in the swirling gloom, shapes moved, an uncountable legion. In flickers of torchlight, one could glimpse twisted faces and skeletal forms. The moaning and scraping rose in a dreadful symphony that churned the blood of even the bravest. Above them, the sky was an iron gray, thick with cloud, so that the pale moon could not illuminate the horror. But they could sense it, endless rows of dead, waiting for some command. Bran was in the great hall, near the dais, protected by a handful of guards. Sansa stood by him, her face pale but resolute. She wanted to stand on the ramparts, but her advisors insisted she remain sheltered as the last of the Stark line capable of leading if the walls were breached. "They've come," she said, almost in a whisper. Bran nodded, unable to speak. Fear knotted in his stomach. A single, piercing cry echoed from beyond the walls, the call of another, a White Walker. Then the undead surged forward, a wave of mindless fury. Arrows rained down from the ramparts, some tipped with dragon glass, finding their marks and shattering bones. Torches flared as pitch was poured onto the battlefield and lit, scorching swathes of the horde. But the wave continued, unstoppable. Where one wight burned or fell, two more scrambled over its corpse. The defenders' lines shivered as the tide hammered into the outer barricades. The clang of steel against rotting flesh, the snap of spears, the guttural growls of the dead, it all merged into a hideous cacophony. Atop the wall, Tormund howled to rally the defenders. "Hold the line," he roared. "Show them what the North is made of." Men braced their spears, driving them into the bodies of wights that climbed up with terrible speed. Some wights were armed, wearing rusted armor from ancient battles, while others clawed up with bare, skeletal hands. The living fought with desperation. But the numbers were overwhelmingly in favor of the dead, and for every wight destroyed, dozens more advanced. A swirling snow began to descend as if the very skies had chosen this moment to bury the living. Visibility worsened. Sansa, in the great hall, listened as the roars and screams grew louder, closer. She had set the interior defenses as best she could. Barricades, lines of halberdiers, archers on the balconies. The war plan was to hold them at the walls. If they breached the gates, fight them in the courtyard. If that failed, withdraw to the keep. And if that was lost, the people would flee beneath Winterfell through the crypts. They prayed it would not come to that, but in truth, most expected it would. Somewhere in the darkness, the White Walkers themselves advanced, their ice blades reflecting torchlight. When they entered the fray, men died swiftly, their screams cut short by swipes of impossibly sharp weapons that froze limbs on contact. The undead pressed the advantage. The outer barricades toppled, sending defenders scattering. Whites poured in, shrieking with unholy fury. The defenders fell back in chaos, some slipping on the icy ground, others losing themselves in the swirling mass of enemies. Tormund, caked in blood and ice, hacked wildly, refusing to retreat until a White Walker's spear lunged for him. He barely dodged, roaring in defiance, swinging his axe. It was a war for survival, and it was turning quickly. On the ramparts, a horn suddenly sounded 3 times, its echo bounding off the castle walls. Gasps rose from defenders who recognized the meaning. Something was descending from the sky. Hope soared in men's chests. Was it Drogon at last? A monstrous roar answered their prayers. Against the backdrop of swirling snow, a black shape materialized, wings outstretched, eyes blazing. Daenerys Targaryen had come, perched astride Drogon. The massive dragon swooped low, unleashing a torrent of flame across a swath of the undead ranks near the gates. An entire mass of wights ignited like tinder, shrieking into the night as they burned. In that instant, the defenders let out a thunderous cheer. The queen had arrived. Perhaps not all was lost. Drogon ascended, twisting overhead, and came around for another strafing pass, unleashing more dragon fire upon the wave of undead. Men redoubled their efforts, pushing forward to drive back the wights from the gates. A fleeting thrill of hope raced through Winterfell. Sansa exhaled tears of relief. Bran watched from within the great hall, hearing the roars of flame and the resurgent battle cries of the defenders. He shut his eyes and dared to imagine that this might be enough. Then, from beyond the flames, a cold wind arose, a wind that seemed to slither across the battlefield. The firelight dimmed. The whites parted, revealing a line of white walkers. At their center stood a tall figure, crowned with ice, mounted on a dead horse. He raised a hand and the swirling snow intensified as if conjured by his will. All at once, the flames sputtered on the ground, threatened by the biting cold. Drogon roared again, diving in for another attack. Daenerys aimed to incinerate the Night King himself, if she could. A torrent of flame spilled forth in a roar of orange and red. The swirl of snow parted under the blast. For a heartbeat, those watching thought they saw the Night King consumed by flame. But as the fire receded, he stood unharmed, raising his icy spear. The watchers gasped in horror. Daenerys' face twisted in disbelief. She wheeled Drogon around, preparing for another pass, determined to break the foe. But in that moment, the Night King drew back his arm with preternatural strength. He hurled the spear. It soared through the air, crackling with an otherworldly chill, aimed directly at Drogon's flank. Daenerys commanded Drogon to bank hard, and he did. But not enough. The spear's tip, glimmering with ice, struck the dragon's side and sank in deep. A roar of agony tore from Drogon's throat, rattling the very stones of Winterfell. His wings faltered. Daenerys clung to the saddle as the great beast fell from the sky, crashing into the fields beyond the castle walls, scattering whites and men alike in a plume of snow and dirt. The defenders on the walls felt their hearts sink. Hope flickered like a candle in a storm. Daenerys was still alive, but pinned beneath Drogon's wounded form. The dragon struggled to rise, jaws snapping at the whites that leaped onto his hide, trying to tear away flesh. Soldiers from the castle poured forth to rescue their queen, dragging her clear with desperate efforts as Drogon's thrashing tail flattened rows of whites. Amid the chaos, the Night King advanced. More white walkers flanked him. An ear-piercing shriek rent the air as the dead turned their focus on the wounded dragon, seeing an opportunity to claim a monstrous addition to their ranks. Daenerys, half-frozen, bleeding from scrapes, was dragged into the castle by her loyal guards, Yora among them, fending off whites as best they could. Drogon roared again, unleashing his fire in a chaotic arc, incinerating wave after wave of the undead. But the spear in his side bled black, and the cold magic of the White Walkers seeped into his veins. Slowly, inexorably, Drogon weakened, thrashing amid a sea of pale corpses. Another spear flew from the ranks of the White Walkers, embedding in one of Drogon's wings, tearing it. The dragon's roar turned ragged, filled with pain and rage. Men below rushed to help, stabbing whites with dragonglass, but they were crushed or torn apart by the sheer mass of the horde. Inside the gates, Sansa watched with terror as the last living watchers on the ramparts shouted for archers to target the Night King. But arrows did no good. The White Walkers advanced, unstoppable. And then Drogon collapsed, eyes rolling in agony. A hush fell, as if the entire battle froze in the swirl of snow. In that hush, Daenerys screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos of battle. The Night King approached the fallen dragon, the haunting glow of his eyes reflecting upon the black scales. He raised a hand. Soldiers who tried to charge him fell to their knees as the White Walkers cut them down with supernatural speed. No living mortal could stand in that presence for long. In the courtyard, men realized with horror what the Night King intended. If Drogon died at his hand, the beast would rise again, an ice dragon bound to the army of the dead. That would be the final doom of Winterfell. Tormund bellowed for men to keep fighting, but their lines were buckling. The gates were compromised. Whites flooded in. The White Walkers battered aside defenders. Screams echoed through the old stones. Sansa retreated inside with her retinue, tears streaming down her face. In the great hall, Bran felt a sudden shift. A wave of cold gusted through the corridors, as if the presence of the Night King had reached into Winterfell. Hodder trembled beside Bran, repeating that single plaintive word, fear etched in his eyes. Bran inhaled, battling the swirl of panic within him. A voice in his head whispered, "If we cannot stop him now, all is lost." Something stirred in him, an instinct that told him to reach out again, to the ravens above, to the heart tree behind the walls. His abilities might be half-formed, but they were all that was left. As the sounds of battle pounded outside, he closed his eyes, focusing. Sansa stood guard near him, hearing the wails of the wounded and the clash of steel. She looked to Bran, uncertain, seeing him breathe deeply. Then, from Bran's parted lips, a low rasp emerged. He felt his mind slip beyond his body, reaching out into the swirling darkness of the sky. The ravens perched in the belfry or soared in frantic circles above the burning fields answered his silent call. He sank into their minds, one by one, forging a tenuous link. Dozens of black wings flapped in unison, swirling over the ramparts. He saw through their eyes, glimpsing the battered dragon, the unstoppable wave of whites, the visage of the Night King. The cold presence hammered at Bran's mind, pushing him away. A lesser warg would have been overwhelmed, but desperation fueled Bran. He commanded the flock to descend upon the White Walkers, harassing them with wing and talon, cawing furiously. It was a futile gesture, but it distracted them for a moment. The Night King swung an arm, shattering half the flock in an explosion of frost. But for a heartbeat, the undead assault paused. In that heartbeat, Drogon, still drawing ragged breath, summoned the last of his strength. With a thunderous roar, the dragon unleashed a final torrent of flame, centered upon the Night King. The swirl of flames cascaded over the icy figure, forcing him to sidestep. A White Walker near him vanished in the blaze. The Night King himself remained untouched by the fire, but forced to shift his attention from raising the dragon to defending himself. Soldiers from the castle made a desperate push, but it was like fighting a glacier with bare hands. Yet that moment's distraction spared Drogon from immediate reanimation. The battered dragon slumped, sides heaving, a trembling mass of scorched scales. The Night King advanced, spear in hand, prepared to deliver the killing blow. Whites clamored around Drogon, climbing onto his massive flanks. Suddenly, a figure materialized from the swirling snow behind the line of whites, lean, wearing a battered black cloak, hair plastered to his face with ice. Jon Snow. He had survived the massacre at Castle Black, and with him was the battered shape of the Hound, half-limping, eyes wild. Jon's face bore the look of a man who had clung to life by the barest thread. He hefted a Valyrian steel sword, long claw. With a thunderous cry, he hacked into the whites that covered Drogon, clearing a path. The Hound roared curses, shattering skulls with a hammer, fighting with the fatalistic fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. For an instant, it seemed they might carve their way to the Night King. But the White Walkers moved with lethal grace. One stepped forward, sword flashing, knocking Jon back. Another lunged for the Hound, who fended off the blow but took a slash across his arm. Blood spattered the snow. The Night King continued his slow advance, unstoppable, as if time itself had bowed to him. Jon, panting, blocked a frost-tipped blade with long claw. Ice chips flew. He tried to sidestep, but more whites closed in, slavering. He was trapped, pinned between the living terror of the White Walkers and a swarm of undead. The Hound roared, flailing against the tide, but was driven back, wounded. Drogon's fiery breath had sputtered out. Daenerys' screams were lost behind the walls. Sansa, from within the great hall, had begun to usher people deeper into the keep, preparing a final retreat into the crypts. But she paused, glancing at Bran's rigid figure as he sat in his chair, eyes rolled back. "Bran," she said in a quivering voice, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We have to go. We'll be overrun." Bran's mind hovered in the space between worlds. Through the raven's eyes, he saw Jon cornered. He watched as the Night King raised his spear once more. The sight of it filled Bran with a primal fear, for he sensed the future. Another spear through Drogon's heart, through Jon's heart, through the heart of every living being who stood in the path of the dead. A savage cold tore at Bran's consciousness. And suddenly, inexplicably, a surge of defiance welled up in him. He was not the three-eyed raven, not fully a. But he was Bran Stark, and the old gods still lived in the bones of the world. He reached out again with his mind, not just to the ravens, but to something older in the land itself, the heart tree at the center of the godwood. His consciousness pressed against the weirwood's ancient presence. The faint whisper returned, trembling with the echoes of all who had prayed under its limbs. For a moment, he caught the ephemeral face of a man half-merged with the roots, an old man with a blind white eye and black blood trailing from his nose. Whether it was a memory or a phantom, Bran did not know. But he felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The weirwood was a door, a channel of the old god's power, untapped in this timeline. He let his mind pass through it. Then, in the courtyard, the roots of the castle's old godwood trembled. The snow parted. With a sound like a rending earthquake, something broke free. The watchers who still lived screamed in shock or cowered in confusion, for across the yard, twisting shapes of weirwood and oak and pine erupted from the earth, ghostly silhouettes manifesting like half-rotted tree spirits. The children of the forest had once disappeared from the land, but their lingering magic had not. Branches entwined, forming shapes that resembled small, ancient creatures. They flickered in and out of sight, ephemeral. The Night King paused, spear raised, turning his icy gaze upon this new phenomenon. Jon seized the moment. With a guttural cry, he pushed past the wights that pinned him, driving Longclaw into one's chest. He charged at the Night King, blade raised high. The nearest White Walker intercepted him with preternatural speed, crossing swords with Jon. Their blades clashed in a flurry of sparks. Jon's eyes blazed with a desperation that bordered on madness. At the same time, from behind, the ephemeral shapes of the trees lunged for the White Walkers. Their touch made the air crackle with ancient power, though they had little physical might left, mere echoes of a vanished age. But it was enough to sow confusion. The White Walkers reeled as if assaulted by a magic older than their own. The Night King hissed a soundless cry. He wrenched free of the specters, turning with deadly intent toward Jon. Snow whipped around him in a whirl of frost and nightmarish wrath. Jon locked eyes with the ancient fiend, feeling the chill of death in his bones. He raised Longclaw, though he knew one misstep would see him impaled. Their gazes met in a moment suspended by cosmic threads. Then, with a savage grunt, Jon lunged. The Night King thrust his ice spear forward. Steel met ice. Jon felt an impact that nearly shattered his wrist. But Longclaw's Valyrian steel bit into the spear's haft, cracking it. The Night King's expression, though emotionless, seemed to flicker with surprise. Jon pressed the advantage, slamming his sword toward the Night King's chest. In a blur, the Night King twisted aside, catching Jon's blow with the remnant of his spear. Frost splintered and a wave of cold blasted Jon, nearly knocking him down. Whites closed in again. Despair threatened to suffocate him. Then a second figure leaped into the fray, dagger in hand. The hound had rejoined the fight, ignoring the bleeding slash across his arm, swinging a torch at the whites, creating a pocket of space. Jon roared and pressed forward. The ephemeral branches animated by Bran's warging magic wrestled another White Walker to the ground, tangling in its limbs. The courtyard had become a swirling maelstrom of unnatural energies. Winterfell's walls dripped with ice, the ground littered with bodies. The fires sputtered. For an instant, time itself seemed to freeze. Jon found the opening. He saw a gap in the Night King's guard. With every last shred of will, he drove Longclaw forward, aiming for the unholy heart of the creature. The Night King raised his arm too late. Valyrian steel met icy flesh with a sound like glass shattering. A scream rippled across the battlefield, though whether it came from the Night King or the storm or the weirwood, none could say. The blade sank in. A web of cracks appeared across the Night King's form, and a piercing blue light flared in his eyes before blinking out. The dreadful being collapsed into shards of ice, dissolving upon the blood-soaked snow. Across the castle grounds, the whites froze in place. One by one, they crumpled, turning to dust, the magic gone from them. White Walkers still standing shattered like fragile crystals, their weapons clattering to the ground. The unstoppable horde collapsed in a wave. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The blizzard began to abate, as if the storm itself had died with its master. Overhead, the last swirling ravens took flight, scattering into the night. For a long moment, no one moved. Then shouts of astonished relief echoed across Winterfell, men embracing one another, sobbing, laughing, sinking to their knees in exhaustion. Tormund tore off his helm and shouted to the sky. Daenerys, carried inside the walls, wept with relief, though her face was lined with sorrow for Drogon, who still lay in the field, grievously wounded. Jorah knelt beside her, tears in his eyes. The hound spat and wiped blood from his brow, muttering a half-curse, half-prayer. Jon stumbled, leaning on his sword, chest heaving, still stunned that he had landed the killing blow. He glanced around, searching for Arya, hoping she too might have survived, but she was nowhere to be seen. She might have been lost in the earlier chaos, or perhaps lying wounded somewhere in the snow. In the great hall, Bran's eyes fluttered open. A wave of utter exhaustion crashed over him as if he had just run for miles. Sweat beaded his brow. Sansa was there, hands on his shoulders, tears of shock streaking her cheeks. "Bran, what did you do?" she asked in a trembling voice, seeing the vestiges of that old magic fade from his gaze. He only managed a faint, tired smile. "I tried." He exhaled, the tension uncoiling in a weariness deeper than any he had known. In another life, he might have been the three-eyed raven, might have commanded the power of the weirwoods with greater ease. Yet in this broken timeline, he had done what he could, forging that tenuous connection in the moment of greatest need. Outside, the survivors gathered in the courtyard, stepping carefully among piles of motionless corpses. The whites no longer stirred. The White Walkers were shattered. Broken ice, scattered bones, the occasional flicker of dying flame. A hush fell, broken only by moans of the wounded and the crackling of smoldering timber. Dawn was a faint glow on the horizon, and in that nascent light, they witnessed the end of the long night, or at least the staving off of it. Winterfell still stood, battered but unbroken. Jon sank to his knees near the shards that had once been the Night King. They melted slowly, steaming in the cold air. He bowed his head, breath rattling. The hound stood near him, staring grimly. Tormund approached, a grin of wild triumph across his bloodied beard. Tyrion and Grey Worm, battered from the fighting, emerged from behind broken barricades. Daenerys, leaning on Yora's arm, stood near the gate, gazing at the remains of her beloved dragon. Drogon lay on his side, breathing shallowly, still alive but grievously wounded. She moved forward, tears spilling from her eyes as she placed a hand against Drogon's heaving flank. He lifted his massive head, letting out a soft rumble. The living had prevailed, just barely and at terrible cost, but prevailed nonetheless. As the first rays of sun kissed the ramparts, Sansa and Bran were brought outside by a group of guards. Sansa's lips parted in amazement, seeing the battle won. Bran stared at the field of death. There were so many bodies, friends, foes, whites crumbling into dust. The ground was churned into crimson mud. He locked eyes with Jon. A silent exchange passed between them, relief, sorrow, 1,000 unspoken words. They had done what needed to be done, yet the price was steep. In the days that followed, they tended the wounded, burned the dead, and tried to come to terms with what had occurred. The undead threat was vanquished, at least for this age. The White Walkers were no more, their master slain in direct combat. The glorious days that might have followed such a victory were tempered by the memory of so many lost. The cost in northern lives had been devastating. The Night's Watch was effectively broken. The land was scarred by the shadow of the near apocalypse. Daenerys remained with the survivors in Winterfell, quietly nursing Drogon back to health if he could be saved at all. Some said she wept every night for the second spear that had pierced his flesh. Bran spent long hours gazing at the heart tree in the Godwood, wondering at the power that had manifested during those final moments. He could still feel that echo of the Greenseer's gift, though he had never fully become the three-eyed raven. Perhaps, in some way, he had bridged the gap in that moment, enough to channel the last vestiges of the old god's magic, enough to distract the Night King so that Jon could strike. Perhaps that was all that was needed. The realm did not require a perfect savior, only enough hope to survive. One afternoon, as the snow began to recede slightly under the faint warmth of the sun, Jon stood by Bran's side at the edge of the courtyard. They watched as survivors loaded carts of debris, hauling broken timbers and rubble away from the shattered gates. Overhead, ravens circled, scavenging among the remains that still had not been cleared. The stench was overpowering, but the living endured. Jon took a breath and murmured, "I'm sorry for what happened to you. I never wanted you to bear any of these burdens." Bran shook his head. "You have nothing to be sorry for. We did what we could. And we're alive." Jon nodded, looking off into the distance. "We have to rebuild. The North, it's in ruins. Most of the realm won't even believe what happened here until they see it for themselves." Bran's gaze drifted to the horizon. He wondered about the future, about Daenerys, about the throne, about the fractured alliances across Westeros. He wondered if the realm would once again be consumed by petty conflicts now that the undead threat was gone. Such was the way of men, to forget the lessons of horror as soon as the dust settled. But perhaps some new unity might be forged out of their shared survival. He had no illusions, though. This was a realm haunted by its own capacity for division. In the quiet hush, Bran closed his eyes, letting the winter wind brush against his cheeks. He thought of the road he had not traveled, the power he had not fully inherited. Maybe that was a mercy, maybe it was a curse. Yet, in this broken timeline, it was enough that they had managed to stand against the darkness, forging their own fragile path. The war against the undead had descended into chaos. Countless lives had been lost, but they had survived. In the end, the spark of hope rested not in an all-knowing green seer, but in the fragile determination of mortals who refused to yield. Sansa came to stand beside them, the three of them gazing out at the aftermath of the war. For a moment, they were only siblings again, children of Winterfell, hearts beating in unison, tempered by tragedy. Their quiet presence spoke of all that had been lost and all that might still be saved. The old world had ended in blood and ice, but a new dawn approached, uncertain yet brimming with possibility. Bran finally exhaled. "We'll rebuild," he said softly, echoing Jon's words. Sansa reached for her brother's hands, clasping them in her own. A raven cawed overhead, a lone black shape drifting in the bleached sky. The cold wind carried its cry across the battered battlements. And though Bran did not follow its flight with Greenseer's eyes, he felt a sense of kinship. The bird soared onward into the newly born day, unbound, carrying with it the memory of all that had passed, and the faint promise that, even in chaos, life endures. A hush hung over the snowbound ruins of Winterfell in the aftermath of the great battle. In those first few hours, the living were too exhausted even for weeping. Husbands discovered wives crushed beneath fallen masonry. Sons knelt in the red-stained snow beside fathers who had died with sword in hand. Old walls had collapsed, unrecognizable lumps of rubble scorched by dragonfire or sundered by unnatural frost. The once proud castle smelled of charred flesh, spilled entrails, and the acrid tang of sorrow. Even crows did not dare descend just yet, wary of the stray tongues of flame that guttered in the courtyard. One morning had passed since the Night King's defeat, since Jon Snow's blow with Valyrian steel shattered the Spear of Frost and ended the ancient evil that threatened all of Westeros. Yet victory felt paper-thin. Wherever one looked, the ghosts of the newly dead seemed to hover, gazing with silent accusation. It was midday when the ragged survivors began stirring with renewed purpose. The immediate terror had subsided, and though the cold remained as biting as ever, men and women realized there was work yet to be done. They could not bury the fallen in frozen ground, so they turned to funeral pyres in the old yard. Half-collapsed outbuildings had been torn apart for timber, and the flames crackled in a row that stretched dozens of yards across. Pillars of black smoke billowed upward, stinging the eyes of those who fought to keep from sobbing. The quiet was a leaden weight on every soul, broken now and then by hoarse orders or the shuffle of boots. Jon Snow moved among them with a numb sense of duty. He had not slept since the battle ended. Dark smudges circled his eyes like bruises, and his left arm hung stiffly at his side, bandaged where a wight had raked him with filthy claws. A deeper ache throbbed in his shoulder. He suspected he had wrenched it while wrestling free of the undead near Drogon. Not that it mattered. The realm was saved at least from the others. Such a victory should have felt glorious. Instead, it was overshadowed by the bodies stacked like cordwood, by the memory of how close they had all come to obliteration. He paused near one pyre. Inside the hastily made timber frame, Ser Jorah Mormont lay motionless, arms folded over his chest. His eyes were closed and his sword was laid beside him. Jorah had not survived the last rush of wights before the Night King fell. He had collapsed with brutal slashes to his torso, and while Daenerys wept and tried to stanch his bleeding, he had murmured something unintelligible and gone still. Jon remembered that he had died in his queen's arms. The flames had not yet been kindled around his body, so Jon bent to brush away the snow collecting on his breastplate. Words failed him. For all Jorah's earlier misdeeds, he had died in loyal service, forging a last bond with the North. Jon exhaled into the cold, a puff of breath that vanished almost instantly, then pressed on. A short distance away, Daenerys stood with Grey Worm, Missandei, and a few Unsullied. They had found a corner of the courtyard that offered some shelter from the vicious wind. She wore heavy furs now, stained with blood at the sleeves. Her eyes were ringed with red, and her once silver hair was matted by melted snow and ash. Yet the set of her jaw suggested she was forcing herself to remain upright, to carry on as queen despite the heartbreak that hovered behind her every word. Drogon lay outside Winterfell's battered gates, too large to fit comfortably in any courtyard, his grievous wounds tended by Maester Wolkan and a few surviving healers. Though the dragon's breath was strong enough to incinerate armies, his injuries ran deep. He occasionally let out a growl of pain that resonated through the castle. Daenerys would flinch each time. She had lost Ser Jorah, and she might well lose her last surviving dragon if infection set in or if the ice spears had done irreparable damage. Grey Worm, stoic as ever, described the final body count among the Unsullied. Their numbers had been decimated in the double battle, first at Castle Black, then at Winterfell. More than half lay dead or else had turned into whites that Jon and others had been forced to cut down. Daenerys's face grew paler with each name he recited. When Grey Worm finished, she dismissed him with a nod. She remained standing there, alone, gazing at the battered towers of Winterfell as if searching for some sign of hope. Outside the gatehouse, Tormund Giantsbane helped a team of wildlings gather corpses. He had lived through the war, though not unscathed. A nasty gash zigzagged across his left bicep and his nose was mashed as if it had taken a blow. Still, he roared orders at the half-dozen wildlings who had followed him into this doomed place. They hauled broken bodies, white and human alike, piling them up for sorting. A separate pyre was being erected for the corpses of the whites, though those had mostly melted into bone and dust with the Night King's demise. When Tormund saw Jon passing, he raised one hand in a grim greeting, then went back to yelling at a wildling who was trying to loot a ring from a dead Northman. "Show some respect, you goat's pizzle," Tormund barked, wrestling the ring from the man's hand. "They died to save your worthless hide." Jon drifted on like a specter, mind only half seeing the destruction around him. He paused at the entrance to the great hall where he caught sight of Sansa Stark emerging into the open. She wore a cloak of thick gray wool clasped at the throat with a direwolf sigil. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, dusted with soot. Blood spotted the hem of her skirts. By her side stood Brienne of Tarth, who still seemed disbelieving that she had survived. The tall knight's armor was dented in multiple places, some plates missing altogether. She had thrown her battered cloak over her left shoulder to hide the tears in the metal. Podrick Payne hovered nearby, a bandage wrapped around his head. Sansa's eyes alighted on Jon, and there was an unspoken question in her gaze. Do we yet live, or is this some cursed dream we share? She took a step forward, but then noticed something beyond Jon's shoulder: Arya Stark. Arya had appeared like a wraith slipping around the charred remains of a scorched wagon. She was spattered in dried blood from head to toe, wearing leathers that had been slashed in half a dozen places. A line of dried gore caked her neck. No one knew exactly how Arya had escaped the onslaught at Castle Black and reached Winterfell's courtyard at the final hour of the fight, but she had. The Hound had sworn that she'd fought her way up the battlements at one point only to vanish into the swirling mass of whites. Jon guessed she had employed the same stealth she learned in Bravos to slip from one lethal confrontation to another. However she had lived, she was here now, staggering with exhaustion. Sansa hurried toward her. "Arya," her voice broke. In the hush of that courtyard, the simple word was everything: relief, heartbreak, apology for every past conflict. Arya blinked, a ghost of her old feral grin touching her lips, then slumped against her sister's embrace. For a time, they simply stood there, unmindful of the swirling wind, each finding tenuous solace in the other. Jon approached and laid a hand on Arya's shoulder. She turned her head to him, confusion and weariness mingling in her expression. He wondered if she was truly seeing him, or if she still fought battles behind her eyes. The entire castle stank of death, and the looming memory of whites pouring over the walls might well haunt them all until their last days. Even that small moment of reunion was broken when a new wave of coughing spread through the courtyard. Someone had tried to shift a pile of rubble and unleashed a spray of dust and ash. Sansa looked around, remembering her responsibilities, and gently pulled away. "I have to see to the stores," she murmured. "So many men and women arrived here before the battle. I must ensure we still have food somewhere for the survivors. 1,000, perhaps more, are still here seeking shelter." Arya nodded in agreement, though it was unclear if she had any words in her just then. She clasped Sansa's wrist a moment longer, then let go. Brienne stepped forward and bowed her head to Sansa as if to say she would accompany her, and together they turned away. Jon watched them go. Then he turned to Arya. "Rest if you can," he said gently. "You look half dead." She glanced at him, that faint smile ghosting her face once more. "I'll sleep when I know we aren't in danger." Her voice was rough. "Dead or not, I think I'll stand watch a while longer." She walked away, limping slightly, refusing his help. Jon understood. They had all been changed by the night's horrors, the dreamlike swirl of near-death. If walking off her pain gave Arya a sense of control, he would not deny her that. He lingered a moment, leaning against a broken column. His eyes flicked upward to the battlements. The sky was a dreary smear of white, the sun a hidden presence behind layers of thick cloud. Smoke from the pyres drifted upward, carrying the stench of burning flesh. Jon's mind drifted back to that final confrontation in the courtyard, the lightning crackle of ice, the ephemeral shapes of the weirwoods twisting among the White Walkers. Bran had done something, Jon was sure of it. He had seen unnatural forms grappling the others, or perhaps illusions that had bought him a precious heartbeat. Yet now that the deed was done, Bran was once again only Bran Stark, crippled and quiet. Jon wondered if he should speak to him, if perhaps knowledge might still linger in the boy. They had lost so many who had glimpsed the truth of this nightmare. Maybe the realm deserved a record of how the dead were finally destroyed. Filled with that thought, Jon trudged into the Great Hall. Its entrance was scarred by black scorch marks where someone had lit a ring of fire to hold back the whites. Inside, men and women huddled near smaller fires, seeking warmth and cooking what meager rations remained. The high table was splintered, benches overturned. Smoke mingled with the stale odor of unwashed bodies. A baby wailed in a corner, and the mother murmured desperate comforts. Most of these souls had nowhere else to go, villagers, farmers, the small folk of the north who had flocked to Winterfell for protection. They had survived, but they wore the stunned expressions of those who had glimpsed true apocalypse. Near the dais, Bran's chair was drawn close to a brazier. Hodder stood behind him, massive arms folded like a sentinel, his face contorted in confusion. He seemed less frightened now that the immediate danger was gone, but echoes of old terror still clung to his posture. Sansa had seen to it that Hodder was protected during the fight, stationing him near the heart tree, though in the chaos no place had been truly safe. Still, he was alive, loyal as ever to Bran. Mira Reed knelt at Bran's side, offering him a waterskin. Bran was too tired to sip more than a mouthful. He looked up as Jon approached, his gaze dim with exhaustion, yet carrying an uncanny weight. Jon nodded in greeting, voice quiet. "How are you, Bran?" The younger Stark swallowed, looked down at the brazier. "I still feel that power. It's like I left part of myself out in the wind last night. My body's here, but my mind," he trailed off, then exhaled. "I don't know." Mira pressed a reassuring hand to Bran's shoulder. "He used the Weirwood's power," she said. "I've never seen anything like it." Jon nodded, remembering how the ephemeral shapes of ancient magic had swarmed the White Walkers at the crucial moment. "We might not have one otherwise." He paused, shifting from foot to foot, uncertain how to phrase his question. "Bran, do you know if that's the end of them? Are we sure the White Walkers are entirely gone?" Bran stared at the flames. For a moment, he looked impossibly old, lines of worry scoring his brow. The Night King was their source. When he died, their magic broke. I felt it like the snapping of a cord that bound them to this world. The others can't exist without him, or so I believe. He fell silent. Jon saw the flicker of relief in Mira's eyes, mirrored in his own. Then Bran added quietly, "I only wish we had known more of them. Why they returned now after thousands of years. What truly made him? What might keep them from rising again in some distant age?" Jon had no easy answers. They stood in silence, letting the crackle of flames fill the hush. Hodder rocked gently on his heels, repeating Hodder under his breath as if that small word was a shield against the incomprehensible. Finally, Jon placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. "Rest. We'll have time to figure out what comes next. We should speak with Daenerys. The realm is still in chaos, and Winterfell is half ruined." Bran nodded, though the weight of sorrow in his eyes was clear. He seemed beyond exhaustion, perhaps beyond tears. Jon hoped a few days of rest might restore him, but in truth, no one would fully recover from what they'd endured. He gave Bran's shoulder a squeeze, then turned away, the swirling gloom of the great hall seeming to cling to him like a second skin. Stepping outside, he braced against another gust of wind. The snow had eased for the moment. He glimpsed the shattered towers of Winterfell, blackened by soot and frost. Repairing this castle would take time and gold the North no longer possessed. As for the fields beyond, they had become a graveyard, littered with the remains of whites and men alike. The entire region was scarred, and rumor had it that many of the lesser keeps across the north had fallen to roving white packs before the Night King's death. But with the White Walkers gone, those whites would have crumpled to dust as well. Perhaps the nightmarish threat had truly ended. Jon made his way to the open yard, where Daenerys stood near a mound of rubble. He approached slowly, seeing the slump of her shoulders, the rawness of her eyes. She was alone now. Grey Worm had gone to oversee the funeral pyres of the Unsullied, and Missandei was helping the maesters tend the wounded. Snow crunched under Jon's boots. Daenerys glanced up, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her gaze flicked across Jon's face, lingering on the bandage that wrapped around his left shoulder. Jon saw her lips part as though she wanted to express relief or gratitude or some commiseration, but no words came. Instead, she turned back to the rubble. "This was once a stable," Daenerys said, voice rough with exhaustion. "I remember arriving here. I thought it shabby and cold. I was arrogant. I had no notion of the horrors we would face." Jon's mouth felt dry. "No one could have foreseen it," he said gently. We did what had to be done." She nodded, but bitterness crept into her tone. "So many died. Yora," she swallowed. "I could feel him beside me in the chaos, protecting me, even in his last breath. And Drogon, he's all I have left of my children. I can't lose him, too." Jon felt a twinge of guilt. In another story, Viserion might have been lost beyond the wall or turned into an ice dragon. But here, the battle's shape had changed drastically. All the same, Daenerys had come north with only Drogon at her side, believing the other two dragons would be best employed guarding her conquests in the south. Now the last living dragon was grievously wounded, perhaps beyond saving. Jon reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, she allowed it, turning her palm to his, her eyes brimming with sorrow. "Maester Wolkan is skilled," Jon said. "If the spears didn't pierce Drogon's heart or lungs, there's a chance he'll heal. Dragons are strong. We must believe." Her lower lip trembled before she bit down on it. Her eyes roamed over Jon's face, as if seeking an anchor in the midst of overwhelming loss. The wind plucked at her hair, sending loose strands fluttering about her cheeks. At length, she nodded. "We'll do everything we can for him." Jon gently released her hand. Another wave of men trudged past, carrying bodies on makeshift litters. A boy too young for war limped behind them, whimpering. Daenerys closed her eyes at the sight, perhaps recalling the Unsullied she had lost, or the fact that she had only glimpsed the White Walkers after 2 battles had already whittled her forces down to a fraction. If only the realm had united sooner. If only the threat had been universally believed. So many ifs. After a pause, Jon said, "We'll need to plan for what comes next. The north is in ruins, yes, but the realm still stands. Many won't believe what happened here until they see the bodies. The Iron Throne is still contested. Your armies have been cut to pieces. The Lannisters may remain a force in the south, or they might have collapsed. News hasn't traveled in this storm." Her expression shifted from grief to steely resolve. "Cersei Lannister spurned my offer of alliance. If she is still on the throne, she remains my enemy. But," she let out a tremulous breath, "I can't bring fire and blood to King's Landing while my host lies in funeral pyres. And I will not leave Drogon until he's well enough to fly." Jon nodded. He understood. She might well be forced to rely on diplomacy, or else attempt some new approach entirely. The days of simply unleashing dragons on her foes were over, at least for now. "I'll help in any way I can," he said. "But you should know that many northern lords see you as an outsider who only arrived at the last moment. Their trust won't come easily. Even after what you did here, some will blame you for losses they suffered for not bringing in your full strength sooner." A flash of anger touched Daenerys' face, quickly suppressed. She rubbed her temples. "I understand. I'll do what I must." They fell silent again, the wind rustling the ragged edges of Jon's cloak. Then Grey Worm emerged from around a broken column, approaching with measured steps. He inclined his head to Daenerys, acknowledging Jon with a curt nod. "My queen," he said quietly, "the preparations are finished. We can light the pyres at your command." Daenerys closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a long breath. Then she squared her shoulders. "Take me to them." Jon went with her, and together they made their way to the line of pyres along Winterfell's eastern wall. There, the Unsullied dead lay in neat rows, each warrior's hands folded over the spear that served as both tool and symbol. Many Northmen, Dothraki, and knights from the Vale also had pyres prepared in an adjacent row. The task of sorting the dead by house and origin had proven too great, so they had done what they could, men from the north in one area, Unsullied in another, freeriders and other mercenaries in another. The grief was universal. Daenerys paused before the pyre that held Ser Jorah Mormont's body. Jon lingered a step behind her, letting her have this moment of farewell. Her face was ashen, but her back remained straight. She raised a torch, her grip trembling, and pressed the flame to the straw and kindling at the pyre's base. With a soft whoosh, the fire caught, quickly spreading upward. The heat licked at Yora's armor, blackening it. Daenerys stared at the rising flames until her eyes watered. Across the yard, various lords and soldiers performed the same act, lighting pyres for loved ones or sworn brothers. Tormund set one alight that held the bodies of wildlings who had fought beside him. Sansa appeared at the edge of the crowd to ignite the pyre containing fallen knights of House Glover, House Serwyn, and others. It was a grim and silent ceremony, the only sounds the hissing of flames and the occasional sob that escaped a mourner's throat. Jon stood with Daenerys as the flames rose, trying to offer quiet support. She neither leaned on him nor stepped away, but at one point, she glanced at him with eyes shining like molten silver. In that look, Jon saw heartbreak, gratitude, and a bond forged in blood. Whatever else came in the days ahead, whether war with the Lannisters, the issue of who would ultimately rule the Seven Kingdoms, or the tension with the Northern Lords, there was a link between them that would not be easily broken. He did not know if that bond was love, duty, or some mixture of both. But he knew they had saved each other's lives in this war. And he knew that none of the petty politics that consumed Westeros would matter if the others had triumphed. Now, with that threat ended, the shape of the future was uncertain. The pyres roared well into the night. Snow fell again, trying to smother the flames, but the fires held, devouring the dead in a final conflagration. Those who had the strength remained to stand vigil until the last embers cooled, sifting the ash for any stray relic or token to give to loved ones. Others retreated to the warmth of the Great Hall or the meager tents propped up against Winterfell's inner walls. By dawn, a thin pall of gray ash lay over the courtyard, drifting in the pale early light. Ravens flapped overhead, but there was little left for them to scavenge, nothing but sorrow and memories. Within 2 days, the healers had triaged the worst of the injuries. Daenerys kept constant watch over Drogon, who lay in a makeshift enclosure outside the gates. The beast's side was bound in thick bandages overlaid with a salve meant to stave off infection. He remained listless, only occasionally rousing himself to hiss or snap at passers-by. She coaxed him to drink water laced with herbs. The maester predicted that if Drogon's temperature did not drop and the wound did not begin to close, the dragon might yet succumb. Daenerys turned pale at such news, but she refused to abandon his side for more than an hour or two at a time. Sansa took charge of the day-to-day affairs of Winterfell. She organized men to clear rubble, salvage usable timber, and patch holes in the walls. She doled out what supplies remained in the storerooms and rationed the feed for the horses. With winter still in full force, the North could ill afford these losses. Any harvest was a dream for a far-off spring if it ever came. Though the long night had been averted, the season itself was unrelenting. Arya prowled the castle like a restless shadow, often disappearing for hours. Some said she went on scouting runs to check the surrounding countryside for stray whites, although no one truly expected any to remain. Others whispered she might be tracking some private list of grudges, but she offered no explanation. Whenever Sansa asked her about it, Arya would only shrug as though she lacked the words to articulate what she felt. Bran spent most of his time in the Godwood, wheeled there by Hodder or Mira. Sometimes he would sit for hours in the snow, eyes closed as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The old weirwood had survived the battle remarkably unscathed, its pale trunk smeared with only a bit of grime. Some of the castle folk believed it was a blessing of the old gods, or perhaps the weirwood itself had protected that patch of ground. Bran remained silent about the matter, seemingly uncertain whether to share the flickering visions that came to him. On the 5th day after the battle, a band of knights wearing the falcon sigil of House Arryn arrived. Led by Lord Yohn Royce, they had been delayed by snow-blocked passes and skirmishes with outlaws on the roads. Though they had come too late to aid in the battle, they brought additional supplies. Food from the Vales, more fertile fields, and some weapons. Sansa greeted them gratefully, though her eyes shone with quiet reproach at their tardiness. Yohn Royce bowed low, apologizing with genuine regret. That same day, a handful of men arrived from White Harbor, bearing letters from Lord Wyman Manderley, who declared his intention to come south as soon as he could muster what remained of his knights. Jon looked on these developments with cautious optimism. The North was gathering again, but it was a battered, starving region. They would need time and unity to rebuild. Tyrion Lannister, in the days since the battle, had kept a surprisingly low profile. He had survived the onslaught at Castle Black and retreated to Winterfell with Daenerys, but the terror of seeing the undead up close seemed to have rattled him. Usually so quick with a jape or a cutting aside, Tyrion spent his hours in a side chamber off the Great Hall, poring over maps and ledgers, scribbling notes by candlelight. Late at night, Jon sometimes encountered him pacing the corridors, muttering about supply lines, alliances, and the precarious nature of power. Jon got the sense Tyrion was trying to plan for the future, for how Daenerys might secure the throne now that the existential threat was ended. But Tyrion was wise enough to see that they were in no shape to march south and seize the capital by force. Not yet, at least. On the morning of the 6th day, Daenerys summoned Jon, Sansa, Tyrion, and a handful of the northern lords to a gathering in what remained of the library tower. Its roof had partially collapsed, letting in strips of pale daylight between broken rafters. The smell of musty books lingered, though many of the tomes had been ruined by snowmelt. A makeshift table had been erected from a fallen door, and around it, they stood in a circle. Daenerys, pale but resolute, Jon looking drawn and pensive, Sansa, with her hair braided in a simple style that did little to hide the exhaustion in her eyes, Tyrion, who fingered the collar of his thick cloak as though it chafed him. Also present were Tormund, Brienne, Davos Seaworth, who had somehow survived the carnage, and Yohn Royce. The hush was broken only by a few drips of melting snow landing in puddles at the tower's edge. Daenerys spoke first. "Thank you all for coming. I know we're all weary, and we've lost far too many, but we must decide how to move forward. The North is wounded. The entire realm is wounded, even if they don't know it yet." Sansa dipped her head in agreement. "My lords, we can't pretend that everything will return to normal. Winterfell needs repairing. The small folk need food. Once the road's clear, if they ever do, I suspect we'll see more refugees pouring in. And that's not counting any conflicts that remain elsewhere in Westeros." Davos cleared his throat. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the battle, ironically matching the missing joints on his right hand that Stannis had shortened long ago. His voice was rough with pain. The realm's troubles didn't vanish just because we slew the Night King. In the south, the Iron Throne is still contested. Cersei Lannister might still sit in the Red Keep, or she might have been dethroned. Gods know what's happened in King's Landing since last we heard tidings. Euron Greyjoy's fleet might be roving the seas. And what of the Targaryen armies in the Crownlands? We have no news. Tyrion folded his arms. "Last I heard, our forces had gained ground around the Blackwater, but this was many weeks ago. I left behind enough Unsullied and Dothraki to hold a small perimeter, but we can't rely on that continuing forever. Either they've pressed the attack, or they've been forced to make some accommodation with Cersei's men. Without ravens, we don't know." Sansa's gaze flicked between Daenerys and Jon. "And what do we do about the question of allegiances here in the north? We've all sworn to fight for survival against the dead. That purpose united us. But now that the others are gone," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "some lords will say the North has bled enough for the wars of the South, that we should remain free, or at least refrain from war." Tormund let out a grunt. "We free folk never cared for crowns. We only came here because that was the direction the dead were marching." He scratched his grizzled beard. "If the dead are truly gone, me and mine might head back beyond the wall, or at least find some empty land to the west. We've lost too many to keep fighting in Neeler wars." Jon nodded. "I understand. The free folk are free to go. We owe you a great debt, Tormund. All of you. You helped save Westeros, whether the Southern Lords choose to acknowledge it or not." Tormund shrugged, though a flicker of something like pride crossed his face. We did." Daenerys's voice remained steady. "I still intend to claim the Iron Throne. That was my birthright, and I've fought for it across the sea. But I also recognize that the North has given all it can. I do not wish to press the North into further war unless it is their choice." She turned her gaze to Jon. "I ask that you support me if I must confront Cersei, but I know the cost you've all paid. I won't demand fealty at sword point. Sansa inclined her head fractionally. Her eyes flicked to Jon with a look that seemed to say, "This is your moment. Do you stand with her fully, or do you cling to the North's independence?" Jon felt the weight of expectation. He took a breath, recalling how he had once bent the knee to Daenerys in a bid to save his people. Then, she had come north to fight for a realm that was not hers, and she had almost lost everything. "I've pledged to support you, Daenerys Targaryen. That hasn't changed. But the North is my home, and these people need time to recover." "We can't simply march south again." Daenerys's posture softened. "Of course. We can wait for news from King's Landing, perhaps send ravens, if we can find a reliable route. If Cersei has fallen or if the city is in chaos, we may be able to negotiate or restore order without further bloodshed." Tyrion loosed a mirthless laugh. "We're speaking of Cersei Lannister. I suspect she'll cling to power until the last breath if she's still alive. But you're right. We can't assume anything. Our first step is to re-establish communication. Winter is not as harsh in the southern regions. We may be able to find riders or even ships out of White Harbor to bring us tidings." Sansa knit her brows. "We must also keep in mind that many northern lords may not want foreign soldiers lingering here. The Unsullied, the Dothraki, what remains of them, your presence is a reminder of the wars that do not feel like ours. They respect your sacrifice, but not all will be comfortable with a large southern host occupying Winterfell." She said it gently but firmly, giving Daenerys a direct look. Daenerys did not flinch. "We have no large host left, Lady Sansa. Our forces are a fraction of what they once were. They pose no threat. I can encamp them outside your walls if you wish." "No," Sansa said. "That would be cruel. Let them remain within the perimeter. All I ask is that we remain sensitive to the North's traditions. We've lost enough. Let there be no further cause for tension." Jon noticed the flicker of relief that crossed both women's faces. Perhaps the battles had forged a tenuous respect between them. He hoped it might last. "Very well," Tyrion said, shuffling some parchments on the makeshift table. "We focus on rebuilding Winterfell, sending ravens to the south and across the narrow sea if we must. Let us learn the lay of the land before deciding how best to proceed. In the meantime, we should also see if the Vale, the Riverlands, or the Stormlands might lend support. If they were spared the brunt of the undead, they may be in a better position to help." Jon Royce cleared his throat. "The Vale stands with the Starks. We'll do what we can. But I'll be honest, we're not unscathed ourselves. Raiders and outlaws have taken advantage of the chaos. Still, I'll speak to young Lord Aaron and see what can be done." Brienne, standing near Sansa, spoke quietly. "We should also mind the threat of roving brigands. With the armies of the North so depleted, unscrupulous men may seek to prey on refugees. Patrols along the main roads would help maintain order." Sansa nodded. "We'll organize them as soon as we can." The meeting adjourned on that note. Cautious planning, uncertain alliances, a future as murky as the smoky light filtering through the broken rafters. They departed in twos and threes, returning to their tasks. Jon lingered at the threshold, watching as Daenerys headed out to check on Drogon once more, Grey Worm following behind. Tyrion trailed them, muttering under his breath about supply inventories and how best to prevent theft. Sansa and Jon walked side by side through the corridor. Snow drifted in through a shattered window, forming a wet patch on the stones. "Do you think her claims to the throne will spark another war?" she asked softly. "The North has no appetite for more bloodshed." Jon's voice held quiet resignation. "There may be war no matter what we do. The Lannisters won't yield easily. Even if Cersei's gone, the next in line may want to keep the throne. But if Daenerys can unify Westeros, perhaps we'll have peace at last." Sansa studied his face, searching for any sign of regret. "Do you love her?" He started, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. He found himself unable to give a direct answer. She fought for us, Sansa. She lost so much doing so. I respect her, and yes, I feel something for her. But everything is so uncertain now." Sansa touched his arm. "Be careful. Even well-meant alliances can end in heartbreak. We have to think of the North, too." Jon nodded, not trusting himself to speak further on it. He was conscious of the swirling feelings inside him, gratitude, admiration, a sense of shared trauma. He had risked his life beside Daenerys, and she had nearly died saving them all. Whether that forged love or a bond of necessity, he could not say. The ache in his chest told him it might be both. In the days that followed, a kind of weary routine settled over Winterfell. The living rose each morning to gather wood, patch walls, tend the wounded, and salvage what food they could from the half-frozen ground or from long-forgotten stores in nearby villages. Snow continued to fall, though with slightly less ferocity. Tormund and a group of free folk eventually decided to head north once more, hoping to resettle lands beyond the wall or near the new gift. Before departing, Tormund clasped Jon's forearm, a rare show of solemn respect. "You're a good man," the wildling rumbled. "But don't let this Kneeler business break you, Snow. We're all free in the end if the gods are kind." Jon chuckled, though his voice was laced with sorrow. "The gods haven't shown us much kindness. But safe travels." They parted with little fanfare. Tormund's band trudged north, a line of silhouettes soon lost in the swirling white. Jon watched them go, feeling an odd pang of envy. They were free of the burden of southern crowns, free of the politicking that was sure to follow. He wondered if he would ever know that kind of freedom. On the 10th day, a raven arrived from White Harbor, battered by wind. The short missive bore Lord Wyman Manderly's seal. It described that his forces were gathering, but the winter snows were too heavy to allow quick movement. Still, he sent ships south along the coast to attempt contact with any Targaryen forces near Cracklaw Point or the Blackwater. Jon and Tyrion found hope in that news, though there was no telling how Cersei might react if she still held King's Landing. On the 12th day, the horns on the walls sounded an unexpected alarm. Men rushed to the battlements, fearful of another undead force. But it was only a small group of travelers riding under a white flag, escorted by knights in battered armor. At their head rode a woman cloaked in thick furs, her face hidden beneath a heavy hood. The banner they held was the Golden Rose of House Tyrell, but House Tyrell was destroyed, with Highgarden sacked. Confusion spread among the watchers until the woman's hood fell back, revealing none other than Lady Olenna Tyrell. The old matriarch had evidently survived the Lannister purge of Highgarden, or perhaps she had been presumed dead. She rode in with a pair of attendants, her posture proud despite her advanced age. Behind her came a train of wagons bearing something covered by tarps. No more than 20 men-at-arms accompanied her. Jon and Sansa, flanked by Brienne, met Olenna in the courtyard. The old woman dismounted stiffly, ignoring the hands of her attendants. She regarded the battered walls of Winterfell with a pursed mouth, then turned her piercing eyes on the assembled Starks. "Well," she said, her voice thick with wry scorn, "I'd heard rumors that the North was overrun by ice demons and dragons. Now I see the aftermath, and it's quite the spectacle. I assume the rumors were true enough." Sansa exchanged a glance with Jon. Arya lingered nearby, eyeing the Tyrell guards warily. "We fought the White Walkers here," Sansa said, her voice carefully neutral. "We prevailed, but at a terrible cost." Olenna sniffed. "I've had quite enough of losing to abominations, whether they be Lannisters or ice monsters. May I come in, or should I freeze to death in the courtyard?" Sansa gestured for her to enter. Jon led the old woman into the great hall, which was still in a state of half-ruin, but at least sheltered from the wind. Olenna's attendants followed, some dragging small chests or boxes, others eyeing the northern soldiers with caution. Outside, the wagons presumably remained under guard. In the hall, Olenna shed her cloak, revealing a deep green gown, and somewhat travel-stained. She noted the burned rafters overhead, the clumsy patchwork of blankets covering shattered windows. "I see your castle is no better off than my own home was, after the Lannisters came calling." She turned to face Jon and Sansa, then Daenerys, who had entered behind them, a swirl of frigid air accompanying her. Olenna's eyes shone with recognition and a sardonic twist of the lips. "Ah, the Dragon Queen. I wasn't sure if I'd find you alive, dear girl." Daenerys approached, Grey Worm at her side. "Lady Olenna," she said, voice laced with a hint of respect, "I believed you had been killed with the rest of your family when the Lannisters took Highgarden." Olenna let out a sharp laugh. "They took my castle, yes, but not before I had certain contingencies in place. My dear granddaughter Marjorie was their victim in the capital. And as for Highgarden, that's ashes now, plundered for gold and crops. But an old woman can still find a way to vanish when she has to. I have been in hiding, traveling in bits and pieces. I learned of your stand against the Night King and decided to see if there was still a realm left to salvage. Daenerys eyed her warily, unsure of the woman's motives. We're grateful for any aid you can offer, but we have little to spare in return. Olenna's glance flicked to Tyrion, who had entered behind Daenerys. You're still alive too, Impgood. I have a bone or two to pick with you about your so-called strategies that left me in the lurch. Tyrion spread his hands, ironically. I'm pleased to see you as well, Lady Olenna. I only regret that our alliance ended so precipitously when the Lannisters attacked. Yes, well, regrets are worthless, but vengeance may still be had. Olenna sighed, turning back to Daenerys. I bring 3 wagons of supplies, grain, dried fruits, some medicines. Not nearly enough to feed all these people, I'm sure, but it's what I could manage. I also have news from the south, gleaned from travelers and bribes. Cersei Lannister remains in the Red Keep, though she's facing rebellions in the Stormlands and possibly the Reach remnants of forces loyal to House Tyrell who fled to the countryside. She's rumored to be seeking a marriage alliance with Euron Greyjoy if they haven't already wed in secret. As for the Crownlands, some of your Targaryen men still hold out near Dragonstone, though supplies there are short. A hush followed her words. Jon felt the tension in Daenerys' posture. She had hoped for better tidings, or at least the possibility that Cersei had already been overthrown. And the Iron Islands? Asked Davos, who'd entered in time to catch Olenna's last remarks. What news of Yara Greyjoy or her uncle Euron? Olenna's expression soured. Euron controls the bulk of the Iron Fleet. Yara, if she still lives, is said to be in hiding or captivity. I've heard conflicting accounts. Euron's ships range the coasts, preying on any vessel that dares sail under a banner not his own. He's rumored to have sacked the remnants of House Tarly's fleet near the Mander. That's all I know. Daenerys pressed her lips together. So the realm is still in turmoil. Then our battles aren't over, even though the dead have fallen. Olenna's old eyes flicked back and forth between Daenerys and Jon. You might have ended the nightmare from beyond the wall, but the petty monsters in King's Landing remain. Cersei is not so easily slain. Sansa stepped forward, inclining her head. Lady Olenna, you have our gratitude for the supplies you've brought. May I ask, what do you seek in return for your aid? Olenna's mouth twisted wryly. Survival. Vengeance. Take your pick. I've lost everything but my life. If Daenerys Targaryen still means to claim the Iron Throne, I will see the Lannisters undone. That is enough for me. I have no illusions about rebuilding House Tyrell. My only heir was Marjorie, and the rest have been slaughtered like sheep. A flicker of genuine sorrow passed her face, quickly replaced by the steely mask. I do this because I'd like to see Cersei brought low, and if that means working with you, so be it. Daenerys exchanged a glance with Tyrion. Very well. Remain with us if you choose. You'll have my protection for as long as you're here, though you can see how meager our resources are. Olenna snorted. I can protect myself, child, but I'll accept your courtesy. And so the last scion of House Tyrell took up temporary residence within Winterfell's battered walls. Her arrival was greeted with curiosity and wariness by the Northern Lords, who recalled how the Tyrells had once sided with the crown against Robb Stark. But times had changed. If Lady Olenna had any regrets over that earlier stance, she did not voice them. Instead, she set about helping with ration distributions, relying on her years of managing Highgarden's vast stores. She also pressed Tyrion about the possibility of forging alliances with the scattered Reach houses who might still be harboring grudges against the Lannisters. The days crawled by, each one a struggle for enough warmth, enough nourishment to keep the survivors going. Yet each day, the wounded found small steps toward recovery. Ser Brienne and Podrick worked tirelessly to set up watch rotations. Beric Dondarrion, though battered, had survived once more, his purpose seemingly fulfilled. He took it upon himself to lead a contingent of men to search the surrounding roads for bandits. Davos joined them at times, though the old smuggler's injuries limited his ability to ride for long. Drogon's condition improved slightly under Maester Wolkan's watch, to Daenerys' immense relief. The dragon began to eat small meals, raw goat flesh scrounged from local herds, supplemented by dead game. Though he was far from flying, at least his eyes no longer glazed with fever. Daenerys took these signs as an omen that perhaps, in time, he might soar again. A month after the Great Battle, the walls of Winterfell had been partially reinforced, the holes in the keep patched. Smoke still clung to the timbers in certain places, but the bitterest cold of the midwinter storms had begun to relent. Slowly, the days grew a fraction longer, though the nights remained unforgiving. Signs of the realm's sundered state trickled in via ravens from White Harbor, the Eyrie, and even from the Riverlands, where pockets of banditry flourished in the absence of strong leadership. The overarching message was that Westeros remained unstable. No single faction held uncontested power. Cersei's hold on King's Landing was in doubt, but rumors persisted that she had brokered an arrangement with Euron to secure the capital against any who might try to oust her. Throughout it all, Bran Stark maintained his silent vigils in the Godwood. Sometimes he would disappear for an entire day, returning at dusk with a distant look in his eye. One evening, Sansa found him near the half-frozen pond, eyes gazing into the reflection of the weirwood's face. She approached quietly, kneeling beside his chair. "Bran," she whispered, mindful of the hush among the snow-laden trees. Are you seeing anything?" He blinked as though surfacing from a dream. "Shadows and echoes," he said softly. "Nothing so clear as prophecy, but I sense that the old gods are restless." He paused, picking at the fur lining on his sleeves. "Or perhaps I'm only glimpsing my own doubts. Sometimes I see the shape of a dragon's wing or the silhouette of a woman with golden hair, but it fades before I can grasp it." Sansa's brows drew together. Could that mean something about Cersei? Or Daenerys? "I don't know," Bran admitted, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. If I'd fully become the three-eyed raven, maybe I would see more clearly. But I was never taught. The knowledge is half lost, half remembered. Sometimes I feel it slipping further away." Sansa laid her hand gently on his. "You saved us, Bran. Whatever else, you helped stop the Night King." He let out a long breath, white mist curling in the cold. "I suppose that has to be enough." Sansa tried to take solace in that as well, though she could not help wondering if Westeros might need that power again in the future, if some new threat arose. The world had proven time and again that it could birth terrors beyond any single generation's comprehension. But for now, they had to rebuild with what knowledge they possessed. Arya's presence in Winterfell felt more tenuous by the day. She grew restless, prowling the battlements or vanishing for hours. Sometimes she sparred with Brienne in the yard, drawing small crowds of onlookers who marveled at her lethal grace. But it was as if her spirit had already begun to wander elsewhere. Jon approached her one afternoon, hoping to glean her intentions. He found her in the training yard, wiping sweat from her brow after disarming one of the Vale Knights in a mock duel. The man stumbled away, cursing good-naturedly. Arya turned, breathing hard, seeing Jon approach. She inclined her head in greeting. "You're restless," Jon said simply, stepping closer so they could speak without eavesdroppers. "Are you thinking of leaving?" Arya looked away, her shoulders tensing. "There's nothing here for me now, Jon. I fought the dead. I helped avenge our family in a way. But I don't feel at peace. Our parents are gone. Rob's gone. Bran, he's changed. Sansa is Sansa. She does her duty, but it's not my path. I have no place here." Jon swallowed, recalling how once, as children, Arya had always been the odd one out, more interested in swords than sewing. Then came the brutality of the War of the Five Kings, her journeys through the Riverlands, Bravos, all those nameless horrors that shaped her into something beyond the tomboy he remembered. "Where would you go?" he asked softly. She shrugged. "West, farther west than anyone. Or maybe south to see the last of the war. I don't know. But every day I stay here, I feel caged." Jon could not find it in himself to argue. He felt an ache at the thought of losing her again. But he understood. "If you must go, go with my blessing. But be careful." Her eyes flicked to him, softening for a heartbeat. "Take care of yourself too, Jon. You carry too many burdens." She paused. "And thank you for trusting me to fight by your side. I won't forget." With that, she offered him a brief embrace, something that felt more real than the stoic mask she often wore. Then she drew away, turning her gaze toward the horizon. Jon saw in her eyes that her decision was already made. She might linger a while longer to gather provisions, but eventually she would slip away like a lone wolf. and that, perhaps, was her destiny. Elsewhere in Winterfell, politics took shape in subtle, careful maneuvers. Tyrion orchestrated letters to lords in the Vale, the Riverlands, even Dorne. He sought to remind them that Daenerys Targaryen had fought for the realm against the undead, that she was no foreign invader but a savior who risked her life. Some letters came back with cautious interest, others with thinly veiled hostility, referencing House Targaryen's legacy of fire and blood. Occasionally, a house's maester wrote simply to inform them that no final decision could be made until the roads cleared, or until spring offered a respite from the endless hunger. Day by day, though, the sense of immediate crisis receded. People began to see past the horror of the White Walkers, focusing again on the old grudges and alliances that had shaped Westeros for centuries. Jon found it disheartening. He had hoped the Great War would unite the realm, but it seemed men's memories were short. Without a common enemy at the gates, they fell back into bickering over titles and farmland and rightful claims. Daenerys kept to her vow not to impose her rule on the North by force, but tension crackled between her and Sansa at times. Some of the northern lords, Lord Glover chief among them, muttered that they should proclaim their independence once more. Others, like the new Lady Mormont, one of Lyanna Mormont's kin, felt honor-bound to support Daenerys for her bravery in battle. These disputes remained simmering coals, not yet ablaze, but only because Sansa managed them with careful diplomacy. As the second month after the battle drew to a close, the weather turned marginally kinder. Whispers of an early thaw drifted in, though no one dared hope for it openly. The crumbled remains of Eastwatch by the Sea still lay deserted, and Castle Black's few surviving brothers were scattered in small outposts along the wall, unsure of their purpose now that the undead were vanquished. Even so, they persisted because 8,000 years of tradition did not vanish overnight. It was late in the evening when Jon found Daenerys in the courtyard, standing near Drogon's enclosure. A ring of torches cast flickering light, illuminating the bandages that still wrapped the dragon's torso. Drogon had improved enough to stand and shift restlessly on his feet, though he had not yet attempted flight. Daenerys was stroking his scaly flank, whispering something in Valyrian. The dragon let out a low rumble, leaning into her touch. Jon approached quietly, mindful not to startle either beast or queen. Daenerys glanced over, giving him a faint smile. "He's stronger today," she murmured. "He tried to climb the outer wall earlier." Terrified, a dozen men patrolling the ramparts. Jon edged closer, letting Drogon catch his scent. The creature's massive head swiveled, and those molten eyes regarded him for a moment. Then the dragon snorted, a puff of hot air that made Jon step back. "I'm glad he's healing," Jon said. "With luck, he'll be able to fly by spring." Daenerys rested her forehead against Drogon's side. The dragon's breathing was warm and rhythmic, a living reminder of the power that still set House Targaryen apart. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice muffled. "We can't stay in Winterfell forever. When Drogon is well, I must return south, one way or another. The Iron Throne does not wait. And Cersei, or whoever claims the capital, must be reckoned with." Jon nodded. "I know. But the North needs me too. Sansa can rule in my stead, though. She has the respect of the lords." Daenerys turned. "Will you come with me then? If I march on King's Landing?" The question hung in the cold night air. Jon felt the weight of it, the memory of his earlier pledge, the sense of belonging or not belonging he had in the North. He thought of the free folk returning beyond the wall. He thought of Tormund's words about freedom. He thought of the vow he had made to bend the knee to protect his people with Daenerys' help. And he thought of the sense of kinship he felt with her, forged in fire and ice. He exhaled slowly. "If that time comes and the North no longer needs me, I'll go with you. But we must be careful, Daenerys. We can't drag these people into another war so soon. If there's any way to make peace," Daenerys' lips twisted. "Peace with Cersei Lannister? I doubt she'll accept anything other than my head on a spike if she's still in power. But I'll consider all options." She stepped closer to Jon, and in the torchlight he could see the faint scars on her face from the night of the battle, the hollowness in her cheeks. "One thing is certain. The living won the Great War, but we might yet lose the peace if we're not united." Jon lowered his gaze. "Westeros is a fractured place. Always has been." She placed a hand on his cheek, drawing his eyes back to hers. For a moment, neither spoke. The flicker of the torches seemed to cast them in a private circle of light. Then Daenerys said, "Stay with me tonight. We can talk of the future or of nothing at all. Just share a moment of warmth in this dreadful cold." Jon hesitated, memories of duty and honor warring inside him, but at last he nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "I'll stay." She led him away from the enclosure, leaving Drogon to doze under the watch of a few unsullied. Their footsteps crunched on the packed snow as they made their way into the keep. Dimly, Jon recalled that this was the same fortress where he had grown up, though it felt like a different realm entirely, haunted by too many ghosts. Tomorrow, no doubt, would bring fresh challenges, more letters to read, more crises to settle, more wounded to console. But for tonight, they could find a brief respite, a fleeting chance to remember that in victory's ashes, life still endured. The next morning, word arrived that a small Targaryen scouting party had been spotted near the Trident, engaged in skirmishes with Lannister men. Both sides had parted after a bloody exchange, leaving a score of dead behind. The realm was still on a knife's edge, the Targaryen claim contested, Cersei entrenched in King's Landing, the North grappling with survival. But there was no immediate call to arms. Winter sealed the roads, and though the dead no longer roamed, the land itself had yet to recover from the ravages of war. Jon braced himself for what lay ahead, remembering how narrowly they had escaped total annihilation by the White Walkers. If men insisted on returning to the old hatreds, he would do his best to guide them toward peace. Failing that, he would stand by Daenerys if war came again, though he prayed it would not. In the library tower, Tyrion assembled charts and rosters, preparing strategies for a possible southern campaign come spring. Sansa managed her courtiers, contending with everything from ration disputes to local squabbles over farmland. Arya quietly prepared to depart in the dead of night. Bran occasionally mentioned glimpses of ravens flying across the sea or the distant echo of a horn beyond the mountains, but he had no guidance to offer beyond cryptic fragments. Weeks stretched on, a bleak waiting game. Slowly, however, the unstoppable churn of the seasons began to lighten the worst of the cold. Reports from the south indicated that Cersei had not mustered a full-scale attack against Daenerys' scattered forces, perhaps wary of the last dragon or preoccupied with Euron's ambitions. The realm balanced on the cusp of spring, neither peace nor open war, a fragile in-between. Many recognized that the peace might break the moment the snows melted enough to allow armies to march. Yet for all the tension, for all the uncertain alliances, Winterfell breathed again. Children laughed in the courtyards, playing among the rubble. Smiths hammered metal, forging new hinges for battered gates. One day, even Drogon tested his wings, managing a short flight from the outer walls to a field half a league away, landing awkwardly but emerging uninjured. Daenerys wept for joy at the sight. That single moment of triumph reminded them that life moved on. The living endured. In the quiet hours, Jon sometimes walked the battlements alone, gazing at the snow-laden trees and remembering the swirling terror of the final battle. He heard the echo of the whites screaming, the clash of steel, the roar of dragonfire. He recalled the cold face of the Night King, how close they had come to a darkness that would never end. And he recalled the ephemeral shapes of the weirwood that Bran had summoned, a magic older than mankind. A single change in fate had meant Bran never fully became the three-eyed raven, leaving them ignorant of so many secrets, forcing them to triumph through desperate courage rather than higher knowledge. Would it have been easier if Bran had possessed that power? Perhaps. But in the end, they had done what needed doing. A boy in a broken body had reached into the old god's power just enough to distract the Night King, and a battered warrior with Valyrian steel had delivered the final blow. Fate was a tapestry, woven of chance and choice, and Westeros would bear the scars for generations. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind on his face. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, Euron Greyjoy, Cersei Lannister, and other threats stirred. The realm remained fragile. Yet they had saved it from a threat beyond all mortal reckoning. That alone deserved a measure of hope, no matter how uncertain the future might be. He opened his eyes to the pale sky, letting the chill fill his lungs. A raven circled overhead, black against the whitening clouds, as if caught between winter and spring. For a fleeting moment, he thought he glimpsed a presence in that raven's gaze. Bran, perhaps, or merely his own imagination. Whatever it was, it gave him a sense of calm. The war against the undead had ended. Life would go on. And so he stood there on the ramparts of Winterfell, resolved to face whatever came next with the same quiet determination. For now, the North rested, battered but alive. The old gods watched from their silent trees, and the men and women of Westeros cast their eyes south, pondering the uncertain dawn of a new age. Though chaos loomed, the memory of the Great War would linger, reminding them that, if need be, they could unite against an impossible foe, and that unity, once tasted, might yet shape the world in ways even the gods could not foresee.